In 2025, the last remaining Waffen-SS veterans are a handful of centenarians who survive in anonymity, scattered across Europe and America. Of the hundreds of thousands who formed part of this elite Nazi force, only a handful are still alive, most of them over 100 years old. One of the most notorious was Otto Günsche, Hitler's personal aide, who was ordered to have his body cremated after the Führer's fall. Captured by the Soviets in May 1945, he spent more than a decade in labor camps before being released in 1956. Günsche never published a memoir and lived quietly in Germany until his death in 2003 at the age of 86. Rokus Misch, a bodyguard and telephone operator in Hitler's bunker, was the last living witness to the final days of the Nazi regime. After spending 9 years in Soviet prisons, he returned to Berlin, where he opened a home interiors shop. Misch never showed remorse and defended Hitler until his death in 2013 at the age of 96. More recently, in May 2023, Erhard Goers, Obersturmführer of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, passed away at the age of 103. Goers was one of the last surviving high-ranking SS officers, and his death marks the close of an era. The first steps of the SS in a world without Hitler. In 1945, the SS began its path to disintegration. Some officers hoped that tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union would explode so they could begin negotiations for a separate peace with the Western Allies, which would allow the Nazi state to survive and fight the Soviet state. When they realized that this would not be possible, they sought to hide the evidence as long as possible. Heinrich Himmler ordered that concentration camp prisoners not fall alive into enemy hands, so they could not bear witness to what they had experienced. SS guards forced thousands of prisoners to undertake the journey in the harsh winter, with low temperatures and without proper clothing. This was called the death marches. These practices significantly increased the death toll. Then it was the turn of the prisoners in the Gestapo and Kripo prisons. On May 6, 1945, Admiral Karl Dönitz, Adolf Hitler's successor, relieved Himmler of his duties. Although Himmler had promised his men that he would take responsibility for his actions, a few days after being removed from his duties, he chose to fall. Many other SS members followed suit. Others were captured by the Allies, while some managed to escape to various countries around the world, especially South America. After Himmler's fall, Ernst Kaltenbrunner succeeded Heydrich as head of the Reich Main Security Office and SS representative at the Nuremberg Trial of major war criminals. Completely helpless and fearful of falling into enemy hands, the SS soldiers continued to search for different methods to avoid being caught. Thus, the German troops had no choice but to return to their homes or hideouts on foot. Since the railway tracks had been almost completely destroyed, the roads had little asphalt and the bridges had been destroyed by bombing, forcing them to swim across rivers. Only soldiers with family in the countryside held out hope of finding their loved ones alive or their homes undestroyed. Every city was devastated, so those who had fought in countries like Belgium, France, Italy, and the Netherlands prayed to reach and be reunited with their living relatives. Some soldiers were content to avoid being discovered by the Soviets. They preferred to lose their freedom under Western protocols. American and British brigades had a reputation for taking Nazis prisoner, avoiding execution after prosecution. Sometimes they were sent back to their home countries, while those who served on the Eastern Front were transported to Stalin's country. However, it was also known that some Western allies executed German soldiers. Not all of Hitler's men were treated equally. The Allies knew that former SS members often had blood tattoos on their torsos. American divisions forced German POWs to march in a straight line, shirtless with their arms raised. Those with SS tattoos were separated. This fact was known to German troops, so it was common for them to wear makeup to cover the tattoo, or in more extreme cases, cut their skin. Once captured, they were identified and interrogated. If they were of a lower rank and had joined after 1943, they were sent to a POW camp and later released. High-ranking SS officers were first interrogated and then sent with the rest of the prisoners or executed outright. Once discovered, the Nazis were stripped of their ranks. Their fate was left to the mercy of their captor. They also distrusted Poles, French, and surprisingly Canadians. The Battle of Normandy had brought out the worst in the Canadian brigades, so they only took SS prisoners if specifically ordered to do so. Otherwise, they were dead men. Furthermore, the Soviets routinely executed those who attempted to surrender. In fact, there were cases where the Red Army annihilated entire Waffen-SS divisions that surrendered. The few soldiers who managed to do so had very low chances of survival. If they weren't executed, they were forced to perform forced labor. The Soviets were known for not using a fair judicial system as the Western Allies did. To this day, some SS soldiers are known as missing. The executioners tried to escape punishment. During the 1946 trials, 74 SS members were accused of crimes, including the notorious cases of Joachim Peiper and Josef Sepp Dietrich. After being identified as associates of units responsible for war crimes, they were interrogated by American soldiers in Schwäbisch Hall, Germany. These members spoke several languages and had managed to escape Nazi persecution. Each of the detained Nazis ended up in different locations, but always near other colleagues. The prisoners often coordinated stories to plan their defense. At the trials, SS members testified under oath, praying that the victims' testimonies would not be third-party testimony. Concentration camp survivors, civilians who had seen their cities destroyed, people who managed to escape brutal massacres, all agreed to testify with the hope of seeing Nazi soldiers spend the rest of their lives in prison. Much of their testimony was supported by nearly 100 testimonies presented to the court, which included various confessions and explanations from the defendants and implicated their co-defendants. Only a few were given the opportunity to testify. The defendants wore uniforms with numbered identification cards around their necks. What happened in the following months and years has been the subject of study and research, becoming a topic of intense interest. The proceedings, along with the pre-trial interrogations, became highly publicized and politicized. However, the convicted SS officers claimed that the American interrogators used illegal methods, including torture, and that all their statements were forced. Ajeg and the battle to rewrite SS history. During the early post-war years, the Allies implemented policies in Germany such as demilitarization, democratization, decentralization, and denazification. Both the British and the Americans viewed this as a supposed victor's justice. During the early Cold War, this idea was challenged by the need to fight communism in the Soviet Union, a nation commonly compared to Adolf Hitler and his foreign policies. In 1950, after the outbreak of the Korean War, the US military's high command understood the need to restore Germany's armed forces. This was exploited opportunistically by many former German officers who demanded the rehabilitation of the Wehrmacht. That same year, they drafted a document called the Himmerod Memorandum, which not only proposed the rearmament of German soldiers but also demanded the release of war criminals and an end to the defamation of Nazi fighters, including those who had served in the Waffen-SS. Aware of the pressure exerted by the West German government, the Allies were forced to commute some sentences for war crimes. In 1951, Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the United States, issued a public statement proposing to distinguish between regular soldiers and the criminal group around Hitler. In this way, he attempted to distinguish certain individuals who did not commit the horrific crimes carried out by the Germans at the top. That same year, some Wehrmacht officers received war pensions. SS members, on the other hand, continued to be considered part of a criminal organization and were therefore excluded from the benefits of this new law. In 1949, a momentous event took place. The ban on the creation of war associations was lifted. Thus began the formation of H1AG, which stands for Mutual Aid Association of Former Members of the SES. Paul Hauser, one of the highest-ranking former commanders of the Waffen-SS, was its first spokesperson. He was accompanied by two renowned former commanders, Felix Steiner and Herbert Gill. After their release in 1954 and 1955, respectively, both Kurt Meyer and Sepp Dietrich became active members. Later, Meyer would become one of the association's most effective spokespersons. In the following years, new members joined, such as Erich Eberhardt, a former member of the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, who replaced Dietrich in 1961. Meyer after his death, and Wilhelm Bittrich, a senior commander of the SS Cavalry Division Florian Geyer, who became president of the HIAG in 1977. The HIAG opened its doors to convicted war criminals, absolving them of responsibility and guilt. Within this framework, Walter Rieder, responsible for the Vinca and Marzabotto massacres in Italy, and Herbert Kappler, the main perpetrator of the Adriatina massacre, were welcomed by HIAG members. According to a publication in its magazine, HIAG's ideology was based on the spirit of European and patriotic sentiment. Over the years, the HIAG began to generate controversy in the international community. With the appearance of its first periodical, Viking Ruf, in late 1951, various speculations circulated accusing the organization of being a neo-Nazi group. In response, Hauser wrote a letter to the Bundestag, the West German parliament, denying these accusations and describing the HIAG as an organization for the defense of former Waffen-SS soldiers made up of upstanding citizens. Its statutes stated that its goals were to provide camaraderie and legal assistance, support Allied prisoners of war, collaborate with families, and assist in the search for missing persons. One of its first pillars was the fight for the validation of the legal status of Waffen-SS veterans. They demanded recognition of their public service, as stipulated in Article 131 of the Basic Law for the Federal Republic of Germany, so they could access the same rights and pensions as Wehrmacht soldiers, arguing that the Waffen-SS was its fourth branch. However, the authorities knew this concept was untrue, as the Waffen-SS was an arm of the SS independent of the Wehrmacht. Furthermore, Waffen-SS personnel were responsible for guarding concentration camps and were implicated in thousands of war crimes during the Western and Eastern campaigns. The HIAG held meetings and conducted a tracking service, attempting to locate the whereabouts of more than 40,000 Waffen-SS members missing in action. These meetings helped to generate a better image among the West German government and society at large. In 1952, the first major mass-attended event was held in the German city of Verdun, where speeches focused on the quest for freedom, order, and justice prevailed. They also declared their readiness to fulfill their duty to the homeland. However, one speech overshadowed the HIAG's efforts to appear good in the eyes of the world. Hermann Bernhard Ramke, a former paratrooper general and convicted war criminal, was invited to express his support and solidarity with the Wehrmacht. However, his words surprised his own people and infuriated those outside them. Ramke did not hesitate to assert that the real war criminals were the Western Allies and that the blacklist of former SS members would soon become an honor roll. These words caused great unrest in West Germany. American newspapers ran headlines such as "Hitler's Guard applauds its ex-chief" and "Agitator General worries the Allies." They also mentioned the roars of approval heard at the event, along with shouts accusing Eisenhower of being a pig and a dog. HIAG authorities attempted to calm the situation, but their attempt was in vain. The Waffen-SS Defense Association used the general disapproval to assert that its constituents were soldiers like all others and that war criminals lived like prisoners of war, arguing that both categories were equal and that neither should enjoy greater benefits than the other. In agreement with other veterans groups, the HIAG called for immediate amnesty and the prompt release of war criminals in Allied captivity. This issue became a matter of great importance, and the German government showed sympathy for the fate of these individuals and promised to ensure their prompt release. After a few months of work, the HIAG began to establish relations with Germany's then governing party, the Christian Democratic Union, and also with its opposition, the Social Democratic Party. Capitalizing on these ties, it gained a degree of public approval and gained a large number of new members. The HIAG's actions were harshly questioned by its detractors, generating some controversy. The association continued its fight on behalf of those imprisoned and executed for war crimes without hiding its members' pride in their Nazi past. In 1953, they celebrated the solstice, the supposed Christmas created by Hitler and his henchmen. During this celebration, they marched toward Stauffeneck Castle in Bavaria, to the sound of Nazi songs that included phrases like, "This is the Guard that Adolf Hitler loves." A year later, at a convention held in the German city of Göttingen, they confronted the Jewish Council and the Student Association, along with the university hierarchy. From 1954 onwards, they mourned the executed war criminals at the Hamelin Cemetery, which became the meeting point par excellence for Nazi war veterans. By 1959, more than 15,000 people attended such gatherings, especially on the 10th anniversary of the death of Bernhard Siebken, a commander who was part of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. In 1961, they attempted to publish an obituary in the Frankfurter Allgemeine newspaper, intended to celebrate Max Simon, a Gruppenführer who was the architect of the Marzabotto massacre. The newspaper refused to publish the announcement, and the HIAG exploded with fury. During the Nuremberg Trials, every member of the Waffen-SS who testified maintained their view that their brigade was purely military, identical to the Wehrmacht. The court rejected this claim, and the HIAG sought to overturn the verdict with propaganda efforts expressing its historical denial. However, there were those who considered the HIAG to be an honorable association. In 1953, German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer described members of the Waffen-SS as soldiers just like everyone else who had simply been recruited. They sought to rewrite history with publicity campaigns, periodicals, books, and public speeches. The HIAG became a model for study for subsequent generations. Several historians agreed that their statements were not only anti-Semitic but also anti-democratic. They were accused of showing no degree of repentance and of continuing to spread their Nazi ideology to their followers, but also to recruit new ones. As the years passed, HIAG became increasingly marginalized, so it dissolved in 1992. Gudrun Burwitz and Stille Hilfe fighting for the remains of Nazism. On August 8, 1929, Heinrich Himmler and Margarete Boden welcomed the birth of their daughter Gudrun. Gudrun Himmler was also known by her married name Burwitz and by the nickname given to her by her father Puppy, which meant little doll in German. She was born in Munich and grew up while her father, alongside Adolf Hitler, planned the most brutal and bloodthirsty war in history. Himmler did not hide his work from Gudrun. In fact, a testimony from Gudrun was discovered during a visit to Dachau. Today we walked around the Dachau concentration camp, and father showed me where the lettuce and cereals grew. Afterward, we saw the paintings the prisoners had painted. They were all very beautiful. At the end, we had a very good lunch. After her father's death in 1945, Gudrun lived a life marked by pride in Nazi ideology. In fact, he publicly denies the extermination in the concentration camps. Gudrun worked for the West German Foreign Intelligence Agency until 1968. In a 1959 interview, she declared, "My father is seen today as the greatest genocidaire in history. I want to try to change that image." Previously, in 1951, she joined Stille Hilfe, an organization that helped former SS members who were detained, convicted, and fugitives, where she was able to expand her fame and prestige within the Nazi environment. In Spanish, Stille Hilfe translated as Silent Aid for Prisoners of War and Internees, and was founded by Princess Helene Elisabeth von Isenberg. Before its original founding, Isenberg and her partners already offered assistance to those needing to flee Germany, especially to South America, which would help them avoid criminal prosecution. Thanks to this collaboration, criminals such as Adolf Eichmann, Johann von Leers, Walter Rauff, and Josef Mengele managed to escape to countries like Argentina. Later, seeing its level of effectiveness, they decided to create a non-profit association with the purpose of channeling resources and donations. Thus, on October 7, 1951, at a meeting in Munich, and just over a month later, on November 15, it was registered in the Bavarian town of Wolfratshausen. According to Isenberg herself, from the very beginning of its activity, the Stille Hilfe sought above all to address the dire needs of prisoners of war and inmates without any rights. Later, a welfare service was created for those accused and arrested as a result of the establishment of war tribunals, whether in the prisons of the victors or in German penal institutions. Initially, legal assistance for arrested war criminals was organized by lawyer Rudolf Aschenauer. Thanks to Stille Hilfe, prisoners of war received vacation pay, salaries, and bonuses. At the same time, they provided support for their families. However, it is important to emphasize that their primary purpose was not humanitarian activities, but rather the promotion of their ideological and revisionist theories. Isenberg was very close to Pope Pius XII and to the Catholic faith in general, which she professed every day. Because of this closeness, the bishops supported Stille Hilfe. However, this was not always an ideological identification. It was also due to the desire to reconcile Germans with their past and the aspiration for a new society in post-war Germany. Johanna Neuhäusler, a bishop who had been tortured by the SS at Dachau, expressed her intention to mend ties and return good for evil. After the Nuremberg Trials, the churches continued to show their support for Stille Hilfe, calling for the release of Nazi war criminals. Stille Hilfe continued to support the accused, such as the sadistic Hildefard Lackert, known as Bloody Brigitte, who worked at the Majdanek women's camp employing questionable methods with the prisoners. They also supported Klaus Barbie, Erich Priebke, and Josef Schwamberger. In 1959, Eisenberg stepped down as president and was succeeded by Gertrude Herr and Adelheid Klug. In 1992, Horst Janssen took over as chairman. Since the 1990s, she has continued to work with political prisoners. Rokus Misch, the last man who saw Hitler alive. These are some cases of Nazi soldiers who managed to survive the post-war period. Rokus Misch was born on July 29, 1917, in Alt-Schalkowitz in the province of Silesia, within the Kingdom of Prussia in the German Empire. His childhood was plagued by tragedy. The son of a construction worker killed in combat during the First World War, and his mother, who died of pneumonia when Misch was just 2.5 years old. While his grandparents were caring for him in 1922, his brother Bruno died after a swimming accident. At the age of 8, his grandfather decided to take him out of school because he felt he needed to learn a trade. A few years later, Misch moved to the city of Hoyerswerda, Saxony, where he became an apprentice to the firm of Schmüller and Model. He slowly began to train as a painter and to work on his craft. In 1935, he began classes at the School of Fine Arts Masters in Cologne. After 6 months of perfecting his craft, he returned to Hoyerswerda to continue his training. There, in 1938, he met Gerda, his future wife, whom he married on New Year's Eve 1942. Together, they raised their daughter, Brigitte Jakob Engelken. Again in his youth, Rokus Misch received a call-up for military service in 1937 and subsequently joined the SS Verfügungstruppe, the predecessor of the Waffen-SS. There, he was selected to join Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, the renowned Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. In 1939, he was jubilantly promoted to SS Rottenführer. During the invasion of Poland, he and his regiment were assigned to the 13th Army Corps, which was in turn integrated into the 8th Army. On September 24, 1939, he participated with 4 other men selected by his company commander, SS Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Mohnke, in negotiating the surrender of Polish troops during the Battle of Modlin. Mohnke was confident in his ability to speak Polish, although his command was at a rather basic level. However, Rokus Misch was unsuccessful and the negotiations failed. He was subsequently attacked by the enemy and collapsed on the ground, losing consciousness. The incident was so violent that Misch had no choice but to suspend his participation in the war and rest for 6 weeks in a convalescent home. His valor earned him the Iron Cross, 2nd class. Once he was recovered, Mohnke sent him to the SS Begleitkommando des Führers, the Führer's escort command, which included members of the SS and the Leibstandarte deemed unfit for frontline service. In his new role, Misch traveled with Hitler throughout the war. Misch was always armed and, along with his comrades, were the only men allowed to carry weapons in his presence. When he wasn't needed as a bodyguard, he served as a telephone operator, messenger, orderly, valet, and waiter. In January 1945, following the German defeat in the Battle of the Bulge, Misch and the rest of the staff moved to the bunker in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. There, he was assigned as a telephone operator, handling all direct communications from the bunker. On April 22nd, his commander-in-chief, Franz Schödler, informed him that he had purchased plane tickets for his wife and daughter to leave Berlin, but Gerda refused to accept them and decided to remain in Berlin, specifically at her parents' house. Misch was an important witness to key events that occurred in the final minutes of the Nazis' reign. After hearing the gunshots in the bunker, he was one of the first to view the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun. He was also present the day Magda and Joseph Goebbels killed their own children and died alongside them. On May 2nd, Misch escaped from the bunker, but was soon taken prisoner by Red Army soldiers who took him to Lubyanka prison in Moscow. At the end of 1953, after his release, he returned to Berlin. Misch found himself in a crisis, unsure how to continue his life. He was offered various odd jobs such as a hospital porter and a driver. These jobs required Misch and his family to move to Berlin, but his wife was very comfortable working as a teacher in Neukölln, so he flatly refused. Fortunately for Misch, he obtained a loan backed by German philanthropists to buy a painting and interior design store, which he ran until 1985, when he retired at the age of 68. Despite the passing of the years, Misch remained loyal to Adolf Hitler, arguing that his former boss was neither a brute nor a monster nor a superman, but a very normal person and a very wonderful boss. Meanwhile, a contradiction emerged in his life. His daughter Brigitte, who supported Jewish causes, discovered that her mother had Jewish ancestry thanks to her grandmother. Misch denied this information, and Brigitte was utterly disappointed, as her father showed not the slightest remorse. On September 5, 2013, at the age of 96, Rochus Misch died in Berlin. Otto Günscher's silence after Hitler's death. Otto Günscher was born on September 24, 1917, in the city of Jena, Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, in the German Empire. At the age of 16, after finishing school, he volunteered for the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. In 1934, he joined the Nazi Party and, between 1940 and 1941, served as Adolf Hitler's adjutant. Subsequently, until the end of April 1942, he attended the SS Officers' Academy and then served on the front line as a Panzer Grenadier Company commander with the LSSAH. A year later, Günscher became Adolf Hitler's personal adjutant. At the same time, he was part of the Führer Begleitkommando, an 8-man SS squad whose mission was to protect Adolf Hitler's life. With the arrival of the Soviets in Berlin, Hitler instructed Günscher to ensure the cremation of his body after his death. The Jena native did not hesitate for a second and obeyed his superior's orders. On the afternoon of April 30, 1945, Günscher took up a guard position at the door of the room in the Führer bunker where Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun died. Together with Martin Bormann and valet Heinz Linger, they entered the study. Quickly, Günscher went outside and informed Goebbels, General Hans Krebs and General Wilhelm Burgdorf that the Führer had died. He then ordered all tables and chairs to be moved so that blankets could be spread on the floor and wrapped around the bodies of the deceased couple. After removing the bodies through the bunker's emergency exit to the garden behind the Reich Chancellery, the cremation began. Once completed, he escaped from the bunker. However, on May 1st, he was arrested by the Red Army. There, he was interrogated countless times about how Hitler died and whether he had used the body double escape method. Günscher refused to answer and was subjected to various tortures. In 1955, after serving his sentence in Sverdlovsk, Russia, he was transferred to Bautzen in the German Democratic Republic. After his release, he received the same questions from the Western Allies, which included testimony in court. Before the judges, Günscher's details were scant. He claimed to have seen the body after it had been moved. However, this statement contradicts the accounts of Kempka, leader of the Hitler Youth, and Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, who recalled that it was Günscher who told them that the Nazi leader had shot himself in the mouth. Hitler's bodyguard denied each of these statements and even claimed that his superior shot himself in the right temple. In 2003, Günscher died of cardiac arrest at his home in Lohmar, North Rhine-Westphalia. Karl Höcke, the everyday face of Nazi horror. Karl Höcke was born on December 11, 1911, in Preußisch Oldendorf, Westphalia, in the German Empire. He began his working career as a bank clerk in the town of Lübeck. He soon decided to resign, finding the work too routine. After more than 2 years of unemployment, he joined the SS in 1933. 4 years later, he joined the Nazi Party. In 1939, he was inducted into the 9th SS Infantry Regiment based in Danzig. In 1940, he was appointed adjutant to the SS officer, the commandant of Neuengamme concentration camp, Martin Weiss. In 1942, Weiss was appointed commandant of the Arbeitsdorf concentration camp, and Höcke continued to serve as his adjutant. The same fate was about to befall Weiss when he was transferred to Majdanek, but Höcke opted to change his path and joined the SS Military Academy in Braunschweig. After that experience, he returned to Weiss's company during Operation Reinhard in Majdanek, this time handling tasks related to mass deportations and murders. In 1944, he was sent to the Auschwitz concentration camp as deputy to Richard Baer, who had been appointed as the delegate. Sometime later, both were transferred to the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. There, they were responsible for administering the area until the arrival of the Allies. At that point, terrified by the possible consequences, Behr falsified his identity in order to escape from the camp and thus avoid identification and, therefore, arrest. At the end of the war, he spent a year in a POW camp. Upon his release in 1946, he was reunited with his children. He quickly began working at a bank in his hometown, in a senior position he had been hired for before the war. In the early 1960s, West German authorities located him and arrested him. He was brought to trial in Frankfurt, where he denied having participated in the selection of victims at Auschwitz, despite being accused by several witnesses. The court found that he was aware of the camp's genocidal activities but could not confirm that he carried out any direct actions, nor did he admit to having personally executed any detainees. In his own words, he stated, "I only learned about the events at Birkenau indirectly because of the manner and length of my stay there, and I had nothing to do with what happened there. I had no influence or ability to influence those events, nor would I have wanted to. I didn't hurt anyone, nor was anyone killed at Auschwitz because of me." However, he was charged with having used violence against more than 1,000 detainees and was sentenced to 7 years in prison. In 1970, he was released and reinstated at the bank as chief cashier. In his statement at the trial, Höcke denied having set foot on the ramp where the selection process took place. In fact, no survivor could identify Höcke's name among those present on the ramp. Although Karl Höcke died in 2000, a photo album he created attracted attention in 2006. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum drew attention to the various images of German officials at Auschwitz while he was a resident there. Among those photographed was Josef Mengele, known for his unscrupulous experiments on human beings. In late 2007, experts reviewed the album to determine if Höcke was actually present on the ramp. In one of the photographs, they observed a man with identical dimensions to Höcke, emphasizing the similarity of his head size, arm length, and even the proportion of his body in relation to his knees. After a 3D scan, they determined that the man was indeed Höcke. However, it was clear that he was wearing an SS Oberscharführer uniform rather than his classic SS Obersturmführer garb. This detail made things more complicated, as it was unlikely that Höcke would have worn the uniform of another official. The versions as to whether or not that was Höcke are still contradictory. Friedrich Peter, the SS officer who rose to democratic power. Friedrich Peter was born on July 13, 1921, in the town of Attnang-Puckheim in the Vöcklabruck district of Upper Austria. His mother was Aloysia, and his father, Friedrich Johann Peter, was a social democratic engine driver. At the end of 1938, Friedrich Peter joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Some years later, during the war, he served as a SS Obersturmführer of the 10th Infantry Regiment of the 1st SS Infantry Brigade on the Western and Eastern Fronts as part of the special units of Einsatzgruppe C. During 1941, Friedrich and his unit murdered at least 17,000 Jews along with 25,000 Soviet prisoners of war. That same year, Peter was awarded the Iron Cross, second class. At the end of the war, he was interned in the Marcus W. Orr camp in the United States. At that time, and for some years after, it was known that the Einsatzgruppen often participated in such massacres, so the Allies were aware of Peter's crimes. However, he took it upon himself to deny not only having participated in them, but also argued that he had no knowledge of any crime, which, according to World War II historians, is practically impossible for a person with the rank of SS Obersturmführer. After being liberated by the Allies, he dedicated himself to teaching primary and special schools, eventually becoming their principal. Between 1950 and 1970, he also served as editor of the magazine of the Austrian Teachers Association. In 1968, he became inspector of state schools in Upper Austria, overseeing all activities in the area's schools. Between 1962 and 1963, the Freedom Party of Austria, popularly known as the FPO and led by Friedrich Peter, began negotiations with the SPO, the Social Democratic Party of Austria, while attempting to appear more liberal to society. In 1964, Peter declared for the first time that both nationalists and liberals had a place in the FPO. This liberalization movement led to intense resistance within the party, leading Peter to expel members who opposed his plans. During the 1970 election campaign, Peter, on behalf of the FPO, declared that there would be no Red Chancellor. However, he subsequently tolerated the actions of the minority government of Bruno Kreisky from the SPO. Kreisky retaliated with an electoral reform which primarily resulted in a strong boost for the FPO. In 1974, Peter became a member of the ORF Board of Directors, which was responsible for controlling and managing the Austrian Broadcasting Society. Following the 1975 elections, Simon Wiesenthal, director of the Jewish Documentation Center in Vienna, published a report that included Peter's Nazi past. It revealed details of his role as an SS Obersturmführer and his complicity in mass murder. Paradoxically, Kreisky, who had been a victim of the Nazi regime, vehemently defended Peter and accused Wiesenthal was accused of using mafia methods and even collaborating with the Gestapo. In 1978, Peter withdrew from running for the Federal Party chairmanship, although he continued to pull the strings of the FPO from anonymity. In 1992, Peter finally withdrew from politics when he fell out with Jörg Haider, then federal chairman of the Youth for Freedom Association, over statements he had made against him. Haider spoke out against the employment policy mandated by the Third Reich, which Peter viewed as a shameful outburst. He confessed that he had been forced to break his self-imposed silence and publicly remind the leaders of the Freedom Party of Austria of their political and statutory duties. Finally, on September 25, 2005, Peter died at Hanusch Hospital in Vienna due to a dangerous kidney disease. Helmut Oberlander, the Nazi interpreter who lived in hiding in Canada, Helmut Oberlander was born on February 15, 1924, in the city of Halberstadt in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, part of the Soviet Union. Oberlander was considered an ethnic German, so in 1941, at the age of 17, he was recruited by Sonderkommando 10A, part of Einsatzgruppe D, during its entry into Soviet Ukraine. Over the months, he became a member of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence agency, and also the Sicherheitspolizei, which means security police. During the post-war period in 1954, Oberlander emigrated to Canada with his wife, Margaret, and lived in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, where he ran a successful construction company. In 1960, Oberlander obtained Canadian citizenship. 3 years later, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Security Service has opened a case on Oberlander. In 1970, a group of German war crimes investigators Occidental questioned Oberlander, who claimed not to have heard about the Sonderkommando and that he had no knowledge of the execution of Jews by his unit. Oberlander's case was filed along with 28 others, classified as special attention by the Commission of Inquiry into War Criminals due to the gravity of the accusations and the availability of evidence. Oberlander eventually admitted to having served in Sonderkommando 10A, but acknowledged that his duties were limited to listening to and translating Russian radio broadcasts due to his knowledge of the language. He was also required to act as an interpreter during interactions between the military and the local population. He was also responsible for guarding military ministers. However, the Federal Court of Canada contradicted his statements, characterizing the Sonderkommando as one of several death squads and holding it responsible for the extermination of more than 2 million people, mostly Jewish civilians. The ruling found that Oberlander was part of this unit between 1941 and 1943, serving as an interpreter and auxiliary. In addition to performing those duties, he worked full-time on tasks such as shining boots and protecting food. From 1943 to 1944, he served as an infantryman in the German army. In the final report issued by the Commission of Inquiry into War Criminals in 1986, it recommended criminal prosecution in Canadian courts for Nazi war criminals. If such prosecutions were not pursued, it suggested stripping the accused of their citizenship and deporting those who had concealed their past in order to obtain citizenship. Therefore, the Commission determined that Oberlander should not have entered Canada, and therefore determined that his citizenship should be revoked. In late April 1995, the Canadian government initiated denaturalization and deportation proceedings against Oberlander, who fled to Florida, United States, where he owned a condominium. After 2 weeks, officials from the Office of Special Investigations threatened him with deportation charges if he did not leave the country. Thus, a few days later, he returned to Canada. In 2000, Judge Andrew McKay stated that there was no evidence that Oberlander was directly or indirectly involved in the charges against him and therefore cleared him of war crimes or crimes against humanity. However, McKay was criticized for not disclosing his war record during his 1953 immigration interview in Karlsruhe, Germany. With this information, the Canadian government announced that Oberlander's citizenship should be revoked. However, the German-Canadian Congress, along with the Ukrainian-Canadian Civil Liberties Association, filed their defenses and lobbied, arguing that there was no convincing evidence to support the alleged evidence. Ultimately, in 2008, the government revoked Oberlander's citizenship, and a year later, the Federal Court of Appeal overturned that decision, restoring his citizenship. The Canadian government took the case seriously and, in July 2017, issued an order in council, marking the fourth attempt to strip Oberlander of his citizenship. In 2018, Federal Court Justice Michael Phelan ruled that the revocation was lawful. Oberlander knew he faced greater risks of prosecution if deported to Germany, where war criminals and accomplices continued to be convicted, so he appealed. The Federal Court of Appeal dismissed his motion to reopen his case due to Justice Phelan's alleged bias in 2008. On December 5, 2019, the Supreme Court of Canada refused to grant him leave to appeal the federal court's decision, paving the way for his impending deportation. As of February 2020, Oberlander remained in Ontario and was filing a new appeal. In October of that year, he lost his appeal to the Immigration and Refugee Board and was subsequently moved to a deportation hearing. In April 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada dismissed the attempt by Oberlander's lawyers to halt the proceedings. However, justice proved slow as Helmut Oberlander died in Ontario, Canada at the age of 97 on September 20, 2021. Alois Brunner, Syria's Protected. Alois Brunner was born on April 8, 1912, in a small village called Nadkut within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As a teenager, he studied accounting and worked as a salesman. In 1931, he joined the National Socialist Party and joined the assault section known as the Sturmabteilung, or SA. This caused him trouble at the department store where he worked, and he was fired. After the Anschluss of Austria in 1938, Brunner enlisted in the Schutzstaffel in Vienna, where he joined Section 1 FB4 of the Gestapo under the direction of Adolf Eichmann. Brunner worked closely with its leader on what was called the Nisko Plan, a failed attempt to establish a Jewish reservation in the town of Nisko in occupied Poland during 1939. Although he held the rank of Hauptsturmführer, Brunner's implicit role in the SS was that of a problem solver. In that role, he began organizing deportations to Nazi concentration camps from Vichy, France and Slovakia. Among his duties, Brunner was commander of a train of Jewish deportees from Vienna to Riga in February 1942. On that trip, Alois Brunner shot and killed several Jews, including the financier Sigmund Bosel, who, despite being ill, had been forcibly arrested and transported from a Vienna hospital. In June 1943, Brunner deported 43,000 Jews from Vienna and another 46,000 from Thessaloniki, Greece. He was then appointed commandant of the Drancy internment camp in Paris, from which French Jews were deported. In 1944, Eichmann ordered Brunner transferred to Slovakia to oversee the deportation of that country's Jews. In the final months of World War II, he organized the deportation of 13,500 Jews from Slovakia to the camps of Theresienstadt, Sachsenhausen, Bergen-Belsen, and Stutthof. Most of these prisoners did not survive, and the few who managed to survive were sent to Auschwitz to be finally exterminated. During the post-war period, Brunner faced the challenge of escaping without being discovered by either the Soviets or the Allies. In a 1985 interview with Bunte magazine, he confessed that his identity was mistaken for that of another SS member, Anton Brunner, who was executed for war crimes. Even Anton Brunner's identity was interchanged with that of Alois, not only by the authorities but also by prominent historians. Alois Brunner stated that he had received official documents under a false name from the American authorities and that he found work as a driver for the American Army a few months after the war. He also received employment from the Gehlen Organization, another American delegation in Germany. In 1954, Brunner fled West Germany with a false Red Cross passport. He first visited Rome and then moved to Egypt, where he worked as an arms dealer. Shortly thereafter, he settled in Syria using the pseudonym Dr. Georg Fischer. A government advisor hired the alleged doctor, Fischer, for a job whose actual duties are unknown, but it is believed that one of his tasks was to advise the Syrian government on torture and repression techniques he had learned while serving in the German military. He's believed to have collaborated with the tyrant Hafez al-Assad to create an unusual repressive apparatus, whose main objective was to control the country through the use of unlimited terror. According to statements by an anonymous opposition activist, this system of danger succeeded in threatening civilians with arrest, instilling fear in them from the cradle to the grave. Some of the repressive practices included stories such as dozens of groups of high school students removed from classrooms by security agents for no apparent reason, a young man arrested for visiting an uncle living near rebel-held territory, a mother, father, and their 6 daughters, ranging in age from 1 to 13, kidnapped for preparing food baskets for needy neighbors, and a 13-year-old boy arrested and tortured to death for walking down a street adjacent to an anti-government protest. For many years, Syria managed to repel Western investigators such as Nazi hunter Serge Klarsfeld and Simon Wiesenthal, who sought every possible means to have Brunner brought to justice. Between 1961 and 1980, Brunner received a large number of parcel bombs at his residence in Damascus. In fact, one explosive letter caused him to lose an eye, and another of the packages caused him to lose the fingers on his left hand. While the person responsible for these surprise deliveries was unknown, many believe it was the Israeli Mossad. In the late 1980s, senior authorities in the German Democratic Republic managed to negotiate with Syria not only the extradition but also the subsequent arrest of Alois Brunner. However, the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 disrupted contacts between the two regimes, and the extradition plan failed. A few years later, in 1995, German prosecutors in cities such as Cologne and Frankfurt offered more than $300,000 for any information leading to Brunner's arrest. In 1999, German authorities suffered a notable disappointment. After so much effort, Alois Brunner had died in 1996 and was buried in a Damascus cemetery. However, upon learning of this rumor, the German press reported that it was a lie. According to their accounts, some German journalists had met him at the Meridian Hotel in Damascus, where he was supposedly living under police protection. At the end of 2001, other reporters also crossed paths with him at the same hotel complex. In 2011, the German magazine Der Spiegel reported that the German intelligence service had destroyed its files on Alois Brunner during the 1990s. Other sources report that Brunner died in 2001 in a Damascus cell completely alone, subjected to his own torture methods. Oskar Gröning, the accountant from Auschwitz who faced final justice. Oskar Gröning was born on June 10, 1921, in Nennburg-Weser, Free State of Prussia, Weimar Republic. His mother died when he was 4 years old, and his father, a textile worker with a nationalist political ideology, raised him alone. After the defeat in World War I, Gröning Sr. joined the Steel Helmets, a paramilitary organization. He was consumed by indignation at the way Germany had been treated since the Treaty of Versailles. His textile business went bankrupt in 1929 due to insufficient capital, and he found a new passion: military uniforms. It was against this background that Oskar Gröning grew up surrounded by discipline, obedience, and authority. As a child, he joined Scharnhorst, the Steel Helmets youth organization, and after 1923 he joined the Hitler Youth. Influenced by his family values, he understood that Nazism was the best path for Germany, understanding that they were people who wanted the best for their country and would do anything to advance its progress. For these reasons, he participated in the burning of books written by Jews and other authors considered degenerate by the Nazis. Gröning was convinced that his help was key to ridding Germany of an aberrant foreign culture, and that National Socialism would have a positive effect on the economy by leading to a decrease in unemployment. While continuing to pursue his political ideology, he graduated with high marks from school and, at 17, began an apprenticeship as a bank clerk. However, a few months after beginning his first job, war broke out and almost half of the bank's employees were drafted into the army. Gröning, who was an apprentice, took advantage of the opportunity to further his career just like the rest of the trainees. However, seeing the swift victories in France and Poland, he decided to contribute to his country. In 1942, Groening abandoned his role as an accounting clerk when the SS ordered that office jobs be reserved for wounded veterans and that qualified members in administrative positions be given more challenging work. After moving to the SS financial offices in Berlin, he received strict orders not to reveal information to his family, friends, or even anyone outside his unit. Shortly thereafter, he was sent to Katowice, Poland, where he was to report to the commandant of Auschwitz. Until that moment, Groening had never heard of the camp. Upon arrival, he and his fellow officers were welcomed into a room with enormous food rations. While he was enjoying the food, someone entered and shouted, "Transport!" and some officers left the room. The next day, due to his experience as a bank clerk, Groening was sent to the barracks where the prisoners' money was kept. At one point, they explained to him that when prisoners were registered for admission to the camp, their money was deposited there and would be returned upon release. Later, Groening learned not only that it wasn't returned, but that Auschwitz was an extermination camp and that Jews were being murdered. At that moment, he understood the cry for transport. Groening counted and sorted the money. He also attended the selection process, not to choose who would be killed, but to protect the belongings until they were sorted. Despite the specific nature of his work, he witnessed children being shot and people unable to walk being humiliated and murdered. On another occasion, he witnessed a Jewish woman wrapping her baby in rags, hiding it on the floor before being sent to the gas chambers. Shortly after, a soldier grabbed the baby by the legs and, upset by its crying, murdered it. This shocked Groening, so he requested a transfer. If the extermination of the Jews is necessary, then it must at least be carried out within a certain framework, he argued to his superior, who denied his request. After experiencing other similar situations, he again requested a change of job, but his superior reminded him that he had signed a declaration. From that moment on, he tried to avoid witnessing the terrible events taking place at Auschwitz. Groening and his colleagues were imprisoned in a former Nazi concentration camp, and in 1946 he was transported to England as forced labor, where he lived a very comfortable life, ate good food, earned money, and worked in Scotland and the Midlands, singing German hymns and English popular music. In 1947 he returned to Germany and asked his wife not to ask him where he had been. He was unable to get his job back at the bank because of his involvement with the SS, but he did get a job at a glass factory where he was promoted to an administrative position, later becoming head of personnel and, later, honorary judge at the court for industrial cases. During a family conversation, relatives accused him of having been a potential or actual murderer at Auschwitz. Groening erupted in anger, banged his fist on the table and said, "This word and this connection must never be mentioned again in my presence, otherwise I will move." Groening contacted Thies Christopherson, a German Holocaust denier and publicist, and told him, "I saw everything. The gas chambers, the cremations, the selection process. 1.5 million Jews were murdered at Auschwitz. I was there." From that moment on, he began receiving threatening phone calls and letters from strangers. He later learned that his comments condemning Holocaust denial had been printed in a neo-Nazi magazine and that they were trying to prove that what Groening had seen was merely a hallucination. So he gave his testimony again and publicly denounced those who accused him of lying. "Believe me, I saw the gas chambers, I saw the crematoria, I saw the cooking stoves. I was on the ramp when the selections took place. I wish you would believe me. Those atrocities happened. I was there." Groening also wrote an 87-page memoir for his family. Since April 21, 2015, Groening has been on trial in Nuremberg, Lower Saxony, Germany, accused of being an accessory to at least 300,000 murders. On June 15th of that same year, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison for complicity in the murder of 300,000 Jews at Auschwitz. On March 12, 2018, at the age of 96, Oskar Groening died before the start of his sentence. This is what happened to SS soldiers after World War II. See you next time.